The laughter hit me like a punch to the chest. I was standing at the front of the church, my father's casket just 3 feet behind me, when I heard it. Not soft, not suppressed, but a full, open laugh. I turned slowly, my hands still trembling from the grief that had been eating me alive for 7 days. And there they were. My wife's family. The Kensington clan, seated in the 4th row like they owned the place, barely trying to hide their amusement. Desmond, my father-in-law, had his hand covering his mouth, but his shoulders shook with barely contained laughter. Cordelia, his wife, was whispering something to their son, Thatcher, who didn't even bother looking down. He just smirked at me. Right at me. During my father's funeral. And my wife, Marlo? She sat between them, her eyes fixed on her lap, saying nothing. Doing nothing. I felt my blood turn cold. "What's so funny?" I heard myself say, though my voice came out weak, broken. Desmond cleared his throat and finally looked up. "Nothing, Garrett. Carry on. We're just reflecting." Reflecting. On what? The worn wooden pews of my father's small-town church? The modest flower arrangements I'd paid for with money I didn't have? The fact that only 43 people had shown up to say goodbye to a man who'd spent his entire life working with his hands? I turned back to face the crowd, my jaw tight, my eyes burning. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip every pew in that church. But I didn't, because I'd spent the last 8 years of my marriage learning how to swallow my pride. That was 3 hours ago. Now, I'm sitting in a cramped attorney's office in downtown Knoxville, Tennessee, surrounded by people who have made it their life's mission to remind me that I'm not good enough, and in exactly 4 minutes, they're going to find out just how wrong they've been about everything. But let me take you back. Back to where it all started. I met Marlo Kensington 11 years ago at a charity gala in Nashville. I was working the event, not attending it. I was 26 years old, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, carrying trays of champagne to people who made more money in a month than I'd see in 5 years. Marlo was 24, draped in a burgundy gown that probably cost more than my car, and she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. I don't know why she talked to me that night. I've asked myself that question 1,000 times since. Maybe she was bored. Maybe she was curious. Maybe she just wanted to see what it felt like to step outside her world for a moment. Whatever the reason, she found me by the service entrance during my break, and we talked for 2 hours straight. She told me about her family's real estate empire, about her father's expectations, about how exhausting it was to always be perfect. I told her about my dad, Earl, who ran a small auto repair shop in Maryville, about my mom, who passed when I was 12, about how I'd been working since I was 15 to help keep our family afloat. We were from different planets, Marlo and I. But that night, none of it seemed to matter. We dated in secret for 3 months. Marlo knew her family would never approve, so we met at diners on the outskirts of town, at parks where nobody would recognize her name. I fell in love with her during those months, with her laugh, her kindness, the way she looked at me like I was somebody worth looking at. Then she got pregnant. I still remember the look on her face when she told me. We were sitting in my truck outside a Waffle House, and she was crying before she even got the words out. I thought she was scared. I thought she was worried about what would happen next. But when I pulled her close and told her we'd figure it out together, something in her eyes changed. She smiled, really smiled, and whispered, "You mean it?" I meant it more than I'd ever meant anything. We got married 2 weeks later at the county courthouse. No family, no friends, just us, the judge, and the promise we made to each other. The Kensingtons found out 3 months after that. I'll never forget the dinner where Marlo finally told them. We drove to their estate in Brentwood, a house so big it had a name. Kensington Manor. Desmond sat at the head of a table that could seat 20, his jaw locked, his eyes drilling into me like I was something he needed to scrape off his shoe. Cordelia kept dabbing at her eyes with a cloth napkin, whispering phrases like ruined everything and could have had anyone. Thatcher, who was 22 at the time and already working in the family business, just laughed. "You married the help?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Classic Marlowe, always had to be different. Marlowe squeezed my hand under the table, but she didn't defend me. Not once. That was the first crack. Over the years, the cracks multiplied. Every holiday dinner, every birthday party, every family vacation I wasn't invited to, but Marlowe attended anyway. The Kensingtons had a way of making me feel invisible, or worse, like a stain on their pristine family portrait. Desmond would ask me how the little repair shop was doing, even though I'd told him 100 times that I'd left my dad's business to start my own landscaping company. Cordelia would comment on my clothes, my truck, my quaint little house in Maryville. Thatcher would make jokes about blue-collar workers, always looking at me when he delivered the punchline. And Priscilla, Thatcher's wife, was perhaps the worst of all. She was new money herself. Her family owned a chain of furniture stores in Georgia, but she'd adopted the Kensington superiority complex like she was born into it. "It must be so hard," she'd say to Marlowe, loud enough for me to hear, "not having someone who can provide the way Thatcher does." The thing that hurt most wasn't their cruelty. It was Marlowe's silence. She never stood up for me. Not once. Oh, she'd apologize later, in private, her voice soft and her eyes wet. "You know how they are," she'd say. "It's easier to just let it go." And I did. I let it go. Again and again and again. Because I loved her. Because we had 2 kids by then, Emmett and Clara, and I didn't want to tear our family apart. Because some part of me still believed that one day I'd prove myself. One day I'd be enough. But my father saw through it all. "That family's poison, son," he told me once, after a particularly brutal Thanksgiving where Desmond had spent an hour explaining why manual labor was a dying profession. "They don't see you. They see a target. I can handle it. Dad?" He shook his head, his weathered hands gripping his coffee mug. "Handling it and accepting it aren't the same thing. A man who accepts being treated like dirt eventually starts believing he is dirt. Don't let them bury you, Garrett." I didn't listen. I should have. But I didn't. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. The doctors gave him 6 months. He lasted 7, stubborn to the very end. When I got the call that he was in his final hours, I drove to the hospital alone. Marlowe had a prior commitment, some charity event her mother had organized. "I'll come as soon as I can," she said. She never showed. I sat with my father through his last night on Earth, held his hand, listened to his breathing grow shallow and slow. When the sun came up, he opened his eyes one last time, looked at me, and smiled. "I'm proud of you, son," he whispered. "Don't ever let anyone tell you you're not enough." He died 10 minutes later. The week that followed was a blur. I made the funeral arrangements alone. Marlowe helped with some of the logistics, but her family's presence hung over everything like a dark cloud. They insisted on coming to the funeral. "It's what family does," Cordelia said, as if she'd ever treated me like family. I should have said no. I should have told them to stay home. But I was too tired, too broken, too empty to fight. That's how I ended up here, standing at my father's funeral, listening to the Kensingtons laugh at me. The service ended with a final prayer, and the pastor invited everyone to the reception at my father's house. I watched the Kensingtons file out of the church, their designer clothes standing out like neon signs against the humble backdrop of the building my dad had attended for 40 years. Thatcher clapped me on the shoulder as he passed. "Nice service," he said. Modest. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My grief had turned to something else, something harder, something that felt a lot like rage. At the reception, things got worse. Desmond cornered me in my father's kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd learned to make my mom's pot roast, where my dad and I had stayed up late talking after she died, where I'd proposed to Marlo with a ring that cost me 3 months' salary. "So," Desmond said, swirling the whiskey I'd poured him, "I assume Earl left you the house?" "I don't know yet," I said. "The will reading is tomorrow." He nodded slowly. "Well, I hope it's worth something." "God knows you could use the help." He glanced around the kitchen with barely concealed disdain. "This place might fetch, what, 150? Maybe 200 if you're lucky?" "This place is my home," I said quietly. "Was your home," he corrected. "Now it's just an old house in an old town that nobody cares about." I felt my hands clench into fists. Before I could respond, Cordelia appeared in the doorway. "Desmond, we should go. We have the Reynolds dinner tonight, remember?" Desmond drained his whiskey and set the glass down on my father's counter. "Right. Well, Garrett, try to keep your chin up. Maybe Marlo can help you sort through all this." He gestured vaguely at the house, at my life, at everything I was. They left without saying goodbye to anyone else. The other guests, my father's real friends, the people who actually loved him, watched them go with confused expressions. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Marlo found me sitting on my father's porch. The same porch where he'd taught me to tie my shoes, where he'd told me stories about my mother, where I'd promised him I'd make something of myself. "I'm sorry about today," Marlo said, sitting down beside me. "No, you're not." She flinched. "Garrett, they laughed at me, Marlo, at my father's funeral, and you just sat there. What was I supposed to do?" I turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time in years. "Defend me, just once. That's all I've ever wanted." She didn't answer. She just looked away. We sat in silence until the stars came out. The next morning, I put on my best suit, the same one I'd worn to her charity gala 11 years ago, and drove to the attorney's office in Knoxville. Marlo came with me. So did the Kensingtons. They hadn't been invited to the will reading. They just showed up. "Family should be together during difficult times," Cordelia explained when I asked why they were there. The attorney, a man named Holbrook Vance, who'd known my father for decades, looked uncomfortable as he shuffled his papers. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to be clear that this reading is typically private." "It's fine," I heard myself say. "Let them stay." I don't know why I said it. Maybe I was too tired to argue. Maybe some part of me wanted witnesses for what was about to happen, because I knew something they didn't. 3 weeks before he died, my father had called me to his hospital bed. He'd been lucid, more alert than he'd been in months, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. A fire, a purpose. "I need to tell you something," he'd said. "Something I should have told you years ago." He'd reached under his pillow and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, yellowed, the creases worn thin from decades of being handled. "What is this?" I'd asked. And then he told me. He told me everything. Now, sitting in Holbrook Vance's office, surrounded by people who had spent 8 years treating me like garbage, I watched the attorney clear his throat and begin reading my father's will. "I, Earl Thomas Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this my last will and testament." Desmond yawned. Thatcher checked his phone. Cordelia examined her manicure. They had no idea what was coming. Holbrook continued reading, listing small bequests to friends and neighbors, a watch to his fishing buddy, books to the local library, his tools to a young mechanic he'd mentored. Then he paused. "And now, to my son, Garrett Earl Whitmore, I leave the following—" The attorney's voice trailed off. His eyebrows lifted. He looked up at me, then at the Kensingtons, then back down at the document. "Mr. Vance?" I prompted. "Is there a problem?" "No," he said slowly. "No problem. I need everyone to understand that what I'm about to read has been verified through extensive documentation." "Get on with it," Desmond muttered. Holbrook Vance took a deep breath. And then he read the number. The room went completely silent. Cordelia's hand froze mid-movement. Thatcher's phone slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. Desmond's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Marlowe turned to look at me, her eyes wide, her mouth hanging open. "Garrett," she whispered. What is this?" I didn't answer her. I just sat there, letting the weight of my father's secret fill the room like smoke, letting them feel, for the first time, what it was like to realize they had been wrong. About me, about my father, about everything. But the will reading wasn't over. Not even close, because what Holbrook Vance said next made the number seem almost insignificant. "There's a condition," the attorney announced, his voice grave. "A condition attached to the inheritance, and it involves—" He looked directly at Marlowe. "Your wife." Every pair of eyes in that room turned to Marlowe. She sat frozen beside me, her face drained of color, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair so tight her knuckles had gone white. I watched her throat move as she swallowed, watched the confusion and fear flicker across her features like shadows from a passing storm. "Me?" she breathed. "What do you mean it involves me?" Holbrook Vance removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, the deliberate slowness of the gesture only amplifying the tension in the room. When he put them back on, he looked at Marlowe with something that might have been sympathy. Or maybe it was pity. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "perhaps it would be best if I read the relevant passage directly. Your father-in-law was very specific in his language." "This is absurd," Desmond interrupted, his voice sharp with barely contained agitation. "What kind of game is this? Earl Whitmore was a mechanic. He fixed cars in a tin shed for 40 years. Where would he possibly have gotten— Mr. Kensington?" Holbrook's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I understand your confusion, but I assure you, everything I've read has been verified by multiple financial institutions, legal experts, and, at Mr. Whitmore's request, 2 independent auditors. The figure stands. Now, if you'll allow me to continue." Desmond's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since I'd known him, he had nothing to say. Holbrook turned back to the document. I quote, "To my son Garrett, I leave the entirety of my estate, valued at the time of this writing at $47,600,000, including all properties, investments, and holdings detailed in Appendix A of this document." $47 million. I heard Cordelia gasp. Heard Thatcher mutter something under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse. But I kept my eyes forward, my expression neutral. I'd had 3 weeks to process this number. 3 weeks to let it sink in, to ask questions, to understand. They were just beginning. "However," Holbrook continued, "this inheritance comes with a single, non-negotiable condition. Should this condition not be met within 60 days of my passing, the entire estate will be liquidated and donated to the charities listed in Appendix B." He paused, and I felt the room hold its collective breath. "The condition is as follows. My son Garrett must obtain a full legal divorce from his wife, Marlowe Kensington Whitmore, before claiming any portion of this inheritance. Furthermore, any prenuptial or postnuptial agreements that would entitle Mrs. Whitmore to a share of Garrett's assets must be rendered void. She is to receive nothing. Not 1 cent. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that comes after an explosion, when the world is still ringing and nobody quite knows if they're alive or dead. Marlo made a sound beside me. It started as a whimper and built into something louder, something raw. "No," she said. No. Garrett, tell him this is a mistake. Tell him." "It's not a mistake," I said quietly. She turned to face me fully, and I saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "You knew? You knew about this?" "He told me 3 weeks ago, in the hospital." "And you didn't say anything? You didn't warn me?" I met her eyes, and for a moment I let her see everything I'd been carrying for 8 years, the humiliation, the loneliness, the slow erosion of my self-worth, the countless nights I'd lain awake wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. "Would it have changed anything?" I asked. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Desmond shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "This is outrageous. This is coercion. You can't force a man to divorce his wife as a condition of inheritance. It won't hold up in court." Holbrook remained unruffled. "Actually, Mr. Kensington, it will. Mr. Whitmore consulted with some of the finest estate attorneys in the state before drafting this provision. It's unusual, yes, but it's entirely legal. Garrett is under no obligation to accept the inheritance. He can walk away from the money and remain married to your daughter. The choice is his." "The choice?" Desmond sputtered. "You call this a choice?" "I call it exactly what Earl called it," Holbrook said. "Freedom." The word hung in the air like smoke. I thought about my father then, about the man I'd known, or thought I'd known, for 37 years. The man who wore the same work boots until they fell apart, who drove a truck older than I was, who lived in a modest house and never once complained about having less than anyone else. That man had been sitting on $47 million, and he'd never said a word. When I'd asked him about it in the hospital, he'd smiled that tired, knowing smile of his. "You want to know why I kept it secret?" he'd said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, Dad, I really do." He'd shifted in his bed, wincing at the pain that never quite left him anymore. "You remember your grandfather, my father?" "Barely. He died when I was 6. He was a hard man, mean sometimes, but he was smart, smarter than anyone gave him credit for." My father had coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made my chest ache. "In 1962, he bought 200 acres of land outside of what's now Pigeon Forge. Everyone thought he was crazy, said he was throwing his money away on worthless mountain property." I'd leaned forward, listening. Then Dollywood came. Tourism exploded. Developers started circling like vultures. My father held on for as long as he could, but by the time he died in '89, he'd sold off most of it, left me everything. "How much?" "Back then, about $4 million. My father had chuckled, the sound dissolving into another cough. "I didn't know what to do with it. Your mother and I, we were simple people. We didn't need fancy things. So I invested it, carefully, quietly, watched it grow." "And you never told anyone?" "Your mother knew. And after she passed..." He'd trailed off, his eyes growing distant. "I guess I didn't see the point. Money changes people, son. It makes them cruel, makes them forget what matters." He'd looked at me then, really looked at me, with those pale blue eyes I'd inherited. "I watched what the Kensingtons' money did to you, watched them use it like a weapon, watched them make you feel small, and I swore that when I died, my money wouldn't be used that way. It would set you free." "Free from what?" "From them, from the life you've been living, from the man you've become." His hand had found mine, his grip weak but insistent. "You're not happy, Garrett. You haven't been happy in years. And that girl, I know you love her, but love isn't supposed to feel like drowning." I'd wanted to argue, wanted to defend Marlo, defend my marriage, defend all the choices I'd made. But the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere deep inside, in the place where truth lives whether we want it to or not, I knew he was right. Now, sitting in this attorney's office while my marriage collapsed around me, I realized that my father hadn't just left me money. He'd left me a mirror, a way to see clearly what I'd been refusing to look at for 8 years. Garrett. Marlowe's voice pulled me back to the present. She'd composed herself somewhat, though her eyes were still red-rimmed and her mascara had started to run. Can we talk, privately? Before I could respond, Thatcher let out a harsh laugh. Oh, this is rich. This is absolutely rich. The mechanic's kid is about to dump my sister for $47 million. You know what that makes you, Garrett? Thatcher. Desmond's voice was sharp. Not now. Why not? We're all thinking it. He's been playing the long game this whole time, waiting for the old man to die so he could cash in and walk away. It's disgusting. I stood up slowly, my chair sliding back with a quiet scrape. Thatcher was bigger than me. He'd played football at Vanderbilt, still kept in shape at his family's private gym. But right now, I didn't care. Your family has mocked me for 8 years, I said, my voice low and steady. At dinners, at holidays, at my own father's funeral. You've called me the help, laughed at my clothes, made jokes about my work, and through all of it, I kept my mouth shut. I smiled, I took it, because I loved your sister and I thought that was enough. I took a step toward him. But here's the thing, Thatcher. My father, the mechanic in the tin shed, built more wealth through intelligence and patience than your family has through all your schemes and deals combined. And he did it quietly, humbly, without ever making anyone feel small. I let that sink in. So, before you call me disgusting, maybe take a good long look in the mirror. Thatcher's face contorted with rage. You piece of... Enough! Cordelia's voice rang out, surprisingly forceful. She'd risen to her feet as well, her perfectly manicured hands pressed flat against the table. This is not the time or place. We need to discuss this as a family, in private. Mrs. Kensington, Holbrook interjected, I should inform you that there's more to the will. Additional provisions that... I don't care about additional provisions, she snapped. I care about my daughter's marriage being threatened by a dead man's vendetta. It wasn't a vendetta, I said quietly. It was a gift. Every head turned toward me. My father watched me shrink, year after year. Watched me apologize for existing. Watched me accept treatment that no person should accept from anyone, let alone family. I looked at Marlowe, and something in my chest cracked open. He loved me enough to give me a way out, even though he knew I might hate him for it. Marlowe's eyes filled with fresh tears. Do you? Hate him? I thought about it. Really thought about it. No, I finally said. I think I'm grateful. The sound she made then was something between a sob and a scream. She pushed past her mother, past her brother, and fled the office. The door slammed behind her, and the silence that followed was deafening. Cordelia turned to me, her eyes blazing. You've destroyed her. You've destroyed my daughter. No, Mrs. Kensington, you did that. All of you. You taught her that money and status matter more than kindness. That looking down on people is a family tradition. That standing by while her husband gets humiliated is acceptable because at least she married up. I gathered my jacket from the back of my chair. I'm going to need a few days to think about all of this. I'll be in touch, Mr. Vance. Holbrook nodded. Of course. And Garrett? There really are additional provisions. When you're ready, we should discuss them. Your father left instructions. Instructions? For how to use the money. What he hoped you'd do with it. The attorney's expression softened. He spent a long time on those pages. I think he wanted you to understand that this wasn't just about freedom. It was about purpose. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak. As I walked toward the door, Desmond stepped into my path. His face had regained some of its color, but there was something different in his eyes now, something I'd never seen there before. Fear. "Garrett," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can work something out, some kind of arrangement." "An arrangement?" "The Kensington Group is always looking for investment partners. With your new resources, we could accomplish great things together." As family, I stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Kensington," I said slowly, "when I was working as a waiter at that charity gala 11 years ago, you looked right through me, like I wasn't even human. And yesterday, at my father's funeral, you asked me if his house was worth anything to me." I leaned in close. "Now I'm worth something to you?" He said nothing. "Have a nice drive back to Brentwood." I walked out of the office and into the harsh afternoon sunlight. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Probably Marlo. Probably her family. Probably a dozen people who suddenly wanted to be my friend. I ignored it. I got in my truck. My father's old truck, the one he'd given me when I turned 16, and sat there for a long time. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. But somewhere beneath all the chaos, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. My phone buzzed again. This time I looked at it. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Garrett, we need to talk. There's something your father didn't tell you. Something about the money, where it really came from. Meet me at the old mill tonight. 9 p.m. Come alone." I stared at the message, my hope curdling into something colder. Because the area code on that number? It was from Maryville. Someone from my father's past. Someone who knew his secrets. And apparently, there were more secrets than I'd ever imagined. I looked up at the attorney's office building, then back down at my phone. Whatever was waiting for me at the old mill, I had a feeling it was about to change everything. Again, the Maryville mill had been abandoned for 30 years. It sat on the edge of town like a ghost, its brick walls crumbling, its windows shattered, its smokestacks reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. When I was a kid, my father used to tell me stories about the place. How his grandfather had worked there before the war, how the owner had shut it down overnight and disappeared, leaving the whole town without jobs. I'd never thought much about those stories. Until now. I parked my truck at the end of the gravel road and killed the engine. The sun had set an hour ago, and the only light came from a pale sliver of moon hanging low over the mountains. The mill loomed ahead, darker than the darkness around it. I should have been scared. Maybe I was. But after everything that had happened in the past 24 hours, fear felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I grabbed the flashlight from my glove compartment and stepped out into the night. The walk to the mill took 5 minutes, each step crunching on broken glass and dead leaves. When I reached the main entrance, a rusted metal door hanging half off its hinges, I stopped and listened. Nothing. Just the wind moving through empty windows and the distant call of an owl. "Hello," I called out. "I'm here, whoever you are." For a long moment there was only silence. Then a light flickered on somewhere deep inside the building. A flashlight, like mine, waving slowly back and forth. I followed it. The interior of the mill was a maze of collapsed machinery and rotting wood. I picked my way through carefully, following that distant light, until I emerged into what must have been the main floor. Rusted equipment lined the walls, looms, maybe, or some kind of textile machinery. And standing in the center of the room, holding a lantern that cast long shadows across the debris, was a woman. She was old, 70, maybe 75, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and a face that looked like it had weathered 1,000 storms. She wore a heavy wool coat despite the mild evening, and when she saw me, she smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Garrett Whitmore," she said. "You look just like your father did at your age. Same eyes, same stubborn jaw. Who are you?" She set the lantern down on a rusted machine and folded her hands in front of her. "My name is Odalis Pemberton. I was your father's business partner for 43 years. The name hit me like a bucket of cold water. Pemberton. I knew that name. It was on the deed to the mill, the original owner, the one who'd shut everything down and vanished. Pemberton, I repeated, as in my husband, Ridley Pemberton, the man who built this mill, ran it for 20 years, and then lost everything in a single night. She gestured at the ruins around us. All of this was his, and when he died, it was supposed to be mine. I don't understand. What does any of this have to do with my father? Odalis laughed, a dry, brittle sound. Everything, boy. It has everything to do with your father. She reached into her coat and pulled out a worn leather folder. Inside were documents, old ones, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting I didn't recognize. Your grandfather didn't buy that land in Pigeon Forge, she said. He won it in a poker game. From my husband. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Ridley was a gambler, Odalis continued. A drunk and a gambler. He'd bet anything when he was in his cups. Money, property, even this mill. One night in 1962, he sat down at a card table with your grandfather and walked away with nothing but the clothes on his back. She thrust the folder toward me. These are the original documents, the deed transfer, the witnesses' signatures, everything. I took the folder with numb fingers and flipped through the pages. The handwriting was cramped and faded, but I could make out enough. A property transfer, a list of witnesses, and at the bottom, 2 signatures, Ridley Pemberton and Cornelius Whitmore, my grandfather. My husband killed himself 6 months later, Odalis said, her voice flat. Left me with nothing, no money, no property, no future. I spent the next 40 years working as a housekeeper, cleaning other people's homes, scrubbing other people's toilets. Her eyes glittered in the lantern light. While your family sat on a fortune built on my husband's desperation. I didn't know, I said. My father never told me. Your father knew. Her voice cracked like a whip. He found out when he inherited the land, came to me, full of guilt and righteousness, wanting to make things right. She laughed again, but there was no humor in it. So we made a deal. What kind of deal? A partnership, 50-50. He'd develop the land, manage the investments, handle all the legal work, and I'd get half of everything. That was the agreement. She stepped closer to me, and I could smell lavender and something sour underneath. For 43 years, your father sent me checks, every month, like clockwork, half of every dollar he made. I thought about the number Holbrook had read. 47 million. If my father had been splitting everything with this woman for 4 decades, that meant the total value of his holdings was nearly $100 million. So why are you here? I asked. If you've been getting your share all along. Because the checks stopped. Odalis's voice turned sharp. 3 months ago, right around the time your father got sick. I called him, wrote him letters, even showed up at the hospital, but he wouldn't see me, wouldn't explain. And then he died, and I found out he'd left everything to you. She jabbed a finger at my chest. Everything, without a single mention of our agreement. The pieces started falling into place. The mysterious provisions Holbrook had mentioned, the instructions my father had left behind. He didn't forget you, I said slowly. He wouldn't have. He was too careful, too deliberate. If he stopped the payments, there had to be a reason. The reason is that he was a cheat and a liar, just like his father before him. No. I shook my head. You didn't know him. Not really. He was the most honest man I've ever met. Then explain the will. Explain why 43 years of partnership meant nothing in the end. I couldn't. Not yet. But something told me the answers were waiting for me back in Holbrook's office, in those additional provisions I hadn't stayed to hear. Come with me, I said. Odalis blinked. What? To the attorney's office, tomorrow morning. If my father left instructions, if there's more to this story, we'll find out together. I met her eyes steadily. I'm not my grandfather, and I'm not going to profit from something that wasn't fairly won. If you're owed money, you'll get it. She studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. 9 o'clock, she said. Don't be late. She picked up her lantern and walked past me, disappearing into the darkness of the mill. I stood there for a long time, the folder clutched in my hands, trying to process everything I'd just learned. My father's fortune wasn't just built on smart investments, it was built on a poker game, a desperate bet by a desperate man. And the ripples of that single night had been spreading for over 60 years. What else didn't I know? I drove home in a daze. When I pulled into the driveway of my father's house, I saw Marlowe's car parked by the curb. She was sitting on the porch steps, waiting for me. Where have you been? She asked as I approached. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying for hours. Taking care of some things. What things? Garrett, we need to talk. We need to figure this out. I sat down beside her, suddenly exhausted. There's nothing to figure out, Marlowe. The will is clear. If I want the inheritance, I have to divorce you. But you don't have to take the inheritance. She grabbed my hand, her fingers ice cold. We can walk away from it, all of it. We can go back to our life, our family, and pretend none of this ever happened. Can we? I looked at her, really looked at her. Can you pretend that your family didn't laugh at my father's funeral? Can you pretend that 8 years of humiliation never happened? Can you pretend that you stood by me when it mattered? She flinched like I'd slapped her. I made mistakes, she whispered. I know I did. But I love you, Garrett. Doesn't that count for something? I used to think love was enough. I built my whole life on that belief. I pulled my hand away gently. But love isn't just a feeling, Marlowe. It's a choice. It's 1,000 small choices, every single day. And somewhere along the way, you stopped choosing me. The tears spilled down her cheeks. So that's it? 11 years of marriage, 2 children, and you're just going to throw it all away for money? It's not about the money. It never was. I stood up and looked down at her. It's about finally seeing the truth, about myself, about us, about what I deserve. I walked inside and closed the door behind me. The next morning, I arrived at Holbrook's office at exactly 9 o'clock. Odalis was already there, sitting ramrod straight in one of the leather chairs, the folder of documents on her lap. Holbrook looked surprised to see her, but when I explained who she was, his expression shifted to something like recognition. Ah, he said, Mrs. Pemberton, your father mentioned you might come. He did. Odalis leaned forward. What did he say? Holbrook opened a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. He left this for you, to be delivered only if you came forward after his death. He handed it to her. He also left instructions for Garrett regarding your arrangement. I watched as Odalis tore open the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in my father's careful handwriting. As she read, her expression changed, from suspicion to confusion to something that looked almost like grief. When she finished, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "He didn't cheat me," she said quietly. He set aside my share, all of it, in a separate trust. He stopped sending checks because he was putting everything into a single account, one that would be protected from estate taxes and legal challenges. She held up the letter. He wrote that he wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of, even if something went wrong with his will, even if his own family tried to contest it. She meant the Kensingtons. My father had anticipated that they might try to get their hands on the money, might try to challenge the inheritance, might try to drag everything into court for years. So he'd protected O'Dallas's share separately. "How much?" I asked. Holbrook checked his files. The Pemberton Trust is valued at approximately $52 million, slightly more than your share, actually, due to different investment strategies. O'Dallas let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. 52 million. After all these years of thinking he'd betrayed me. She pressed the letter to her chest. He was protecting me, right up until the end. I felt something loosen in my chest. My father had been carrying so many secrets, so many burdens, but in the end, he'd tried to make everything right. "There's one more thing," Holbrook said. He pulled out another document and handed it to me. "Your father's instructions for how to use your inheritance." He was very specific. I read through the pages slowly. My father wanted me to rebuild the Maryville Mill, not as a factory, but as a community center, a place for job training, small business development, educational programs. He wanted me to invest in the town that had raised him, to create opportunities for people who'd been left behind. And at the bottom of the final page, in his own handwriting, was a note. "Garrett, money is just a tool. It can build or destroy, depending on who holds it. I spent my whole life building quietly, saving for a future I knew I wouldn't see. Now it's your turn. Don't let the weight of it crush you. Don't let the Kensingtons or anyone else convince you that wealth makes you better than others. Stay humble, stay kind, and most importantly, stay free. I love you, son. I always have. Dad." I set the document down and wiped my eyes. The door to the office burst open. Desmond Kensington strode in, followed by Cordelia, Thatcher, and a man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize. "This is Whitfield Crane," Desmond announced. "Our attorney. We're contesting the will." Holbrook sighed. "On what grounds?" "Undue influence, mental incapacity, take your pick." Desmond's eyes swept over me, over O'Dallas, over everything. Earl Whitmore was a dying man manipulated by his bitter, gold-digging son. We'll prove it in court. I stood up slowly. "Mr. Kensington," I said, "my father spent the last year of his life making sure every detail of this will was airtight. He hired 3 separate law firms to review it. He had witnesses, medical evaluations, and enough documentation to fill a small library." I smiled. "You want to contest it? Go ahead. Spend the next 5 years in court. Burn through your family's money fighting a battle you can't win." Desmond's face reddened. "You think you've won? You think because you have money now, you're one of us?" "No," I said. "I think I finally understand that I never wanted to be one of you." I walked toward the door, then stopped. "Oh, and one more thing. I've made my decision about the inheritance." I looked at Marlowe, who had appeared in the doorway behind her family, her face pale and drawn. "I'm accepting it. All of it." "Garrett," she started. "The divorce papers will be filed tomorrow. You'll receive fair support for the children, as Tennessee law requires. But nothing more." I held her gaze. "I hope someday you find the courage to be more than your family made you. I really do. But I can't wait for that day anymore." I walked out of the office and into the morning sunlight. Behind me, I heard Cordelia's voice rise in fury. Heard Desmond shouting something about lawyers and courts and making me regret this. But their voices faded as I reached my truck, as I climbed inside, as I started the engine and pulled away. 3 months later, I broke ground on the Earl Whitmore Community Center. Odalis was there for the ceremony, along with dozens of people from Maryville, friends of my father, neighbors who remembered him, young people looking for opportunities. My children were there too. Emmett and Clara had taken the divorce hard at first, but they were adjusting. I'd promised them that no matter what happened between their mother and me, I would always be their father. I would always choose them. Marlo didn't come to the ceremony. I heard through mutual friends that she'd moved back in with her parents, that she was taking time to heal. I hoped that was true. Despite everything, I didn't wish her harm. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd gathered in front of the old mill, soon to be transformed into something new, I thought about my father's last words to me. Stay free. For the first time in years, I understood what he meant. Freedom wasn't about money. It wasn't about escaping the Kensingtons or proving myself to anyone. It was about finally believing that I was enough, that I had always been enough. My father had known that truth his whole life, and in the end, he'd given me everything I needed to discover it for myself. I looked up at the sky, blue and endless, and smiled. Thanks, Dad, I whispered, for everything. Somewhere, I knew he was smiling back.